I said, welcome on behalf of the Riley County Genealogical Society. We're excited this year to get our 2024 series of programs up and going. One of the things we've undertaken with Charlene's leadership and a lot of volunteers from the community is a new project called Walking Through History on the Linear Trail. And we're researching different aspects of the history of Manhattan. And our programs this year are going to follow along with a lot of the history they're discovering, as well as the fact that we're going to be putting markers up at various places around, documenting these different pieces of history that are coming along. So this is the first of that series of programs. We're starting with the Indians, as you might guess, because they probably were among the first that were here in the Manhattan area. And then they're segueing into the beginning of white men coming and the towns and the people, looking at the diaries and the letters that were written by early settlers as they tried to establish communities along the rivers here. So that will be a program next month. Guess I should find the actual name of it here. Forming a Free State Manhattan in Kansas Territory, and that's going to be by Alana Parker. And she's going to be giving us an early founding of Manhattan through the letters and diaries of early pioneers, which I think will be very interesting. She's a local historian who has worked at the museum and other places over the years. The next program in April, which we already have set up, is going to look at what it was like moving west, coming to Kansas in covered wagons with horses and wagons and walking barefoot and wearing colonial garb and all of the other aspects I think that Susan is going to cover here. And I'm looking forward to her description because she's been very involved in museum work and reenactment and telling the stories from perspective of the pioneers themselves. So it will be a fun start to the program, and then as we move on into the year, the other programs are lined up, but just not quite dated yet, so we have to get our venues reserved for the right times. But the trail markers are coming. The first 5 that will be installed this year have to do with where the Hartford steamboat ran aground, and that marker will be at the South Manhattan Trailhead, I think. And they're going to document where the black settlement after the Civil War occurred along Potawatomi Trailhead, where the Kaw Indian Village was at the Blue River Access Trailhead, and where the Underground Railroad spur was along Hayes Drive Trailhead, and the town of Palestra, which was established in 1854 at the trailhead behind the 4 Point Sheraton out by Sethchild. So those are the 5 that we hope to have this year, with a dedication in June of those, if everything goes according to plan. And then in 2025, assuming the Corps of Engineers gives us permission, up on the levee itself will be a marker for the town of Canton, the opening of Kansas Territory, arrival of the Free Staters, the town of Boston, flood information about how the floods have impacted Manhattan over the years, and the railroads and their impact on the development of the area. So some great topics and some great markers coming along, and we're anxious to see how this all develops, and I hope the community buys into the history of our town and the interest that the researchers are garnering and learning all about the history of Manhattan, Kansas. Mary, what's the name am I looking for your group? Oh, the Chapman Center. The Chapman Center is one of the partners in this, and they are going to host a website where all this information, these talks that we have, the information about the trail markers themselves and everything. Young man in the back is videotaping this today so that there will be a record of it on the website, and there are little flyers on the table as you came in that you can pick up that give you the access to it. Obviously, this is kind of the first, so it's just getting up and going, but it should be a great way for us to keep track of everything that's happening on this project, and it's exciting to watch it start.
You guys are good.
We have a few chairs chairs up front here, if anybody wants to come up to the second row. And up here in the first row, there's chairs. So let's do and there. It's a nice problem to have, be running on chairs. So. Anyway, with that introduction of what's coming, our speaker today is going to talk to us about, well, as it says, Kanza Home at Blue Earth. And our speaker is Lauren Ritterbush, who is a professor at West Virginia University in the anthropology department. Is that? What did I say? I'm sorry. I've been in West Virginia for 45 years. You did. I'm sorry. West Virginia history doesn't really mesh with Kansas, except in here, I guess. So I've only been here 5 years, and I just cannot get that out of my vocabulary. Sorry about that. Let's try this again. As an archaeologist and ethnohistorian, Lauren Ritterbush strives to understand the indigenous people who have lived on the Great Plains and adjacent Midwest through time. She does so as professor of anthropology at Kansas State University, where she teaches courses in archaeology, critical thinking, and museum collection management. And Lauren, I will let you tell the rest of your story. You'll probably get it better than I can.
First of all, thank you all for being here, and also thank the Riley County Genealogical Society, not just for inviting me, but I am so excited about the markers they're going to be putting up. I know I have been talking to the city about this almost as long as I've been here, and they've made some progress, but I know that that progress is really going to speed up now, and I really appreciate all the efforts of the Riley County Genealogical Society, the City of Manhattan, the Chapman Center, and just everyone who's been involved with that. Really do appreciate that. Yes, it is. Feel free to move them over. So, as Ginny mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the Kanza. The Kanza Native American tribe, and as an archaeologist and ethnohistorian, I'm looking at their past. But let's not forget that the Kanza are still here today, have a very vibrant culture and a very deep history, and this area was part of their history. So although we call this place home today, many generations of other people have also, including the Kanza. And so I'm going to talk about that time period preceding nearly all of what you see up here, except for maybe overlapping a little bit with this gentleman, that when the Kanza made this area home. To do that, I'm going to give you a little bit of background and show you some of the different resources we use to try to reach into the past. Because we have to use an assortment of different kinds of information to understand those aspects of the past that may not be as readily visible today. So let's start out learning a little bit about the Kanza themselves. So if we look at their language, the Kanza speak a particular language that derives or is related to many other Native American languages. They're all within what's called the Siouan language group or language family. And many different Native Americans spoke languages within this family group, all the way from the southeastern part of the United States all the way up into Canada. So it's a very broad language group, but it's important to look at because we can see relationships between groups by their languages. And so if you look at this very large chart, you'll see that many different branches. We're going to go down to the central branch of the Degian speakers. So in this particular branch of the Siouan language, we have 5 different historic tribes that all spoke very similar languages to one another. The Quapaw, the Kanza, and Osage, the Omaha, and the Ponca. In linguistic studies, and I should be relying on people like Mary Kahn here, but linguistic studies show us which ones are the most closely related to each other. And so we can see that the Kanza are very closely related. Their language is very closely related to the Osage. And in fact, they still today pretty much recognize themselves as relatives to the Osage. Well, why is this important? Well, sometimes we have gaps in our knowledge about the past, and so we can look at these different groups and see if we can get other information from those groups and that we know they're most closely related to. So one set of information that has been very helpful in trying to trace back into time the Kanza and their relatives here is to look at oral traditions. So we look at the oral traditions of these Digian speakers of all these different groups. And we see that at one time they were either together or at least probably in a similar area and related to each other, maybe descended from the same ancestors. We're going very far back in time. We're not going to go back quite that far. But if we want to trace where the Kanza came from, there were many different Native American groups that lived in this area over 13,500 years, maybe longer. So the Kanza were not, the ancestors of today's Kanza were not the first in this area. They were ones who moved into this area. Native American groups, just as groups today, move around a lot. So they're constantly shifting to different areas. And so we know that Kanza came here relatively late, when you're talking over almost 14,000 years, relatively late. But of course much earlier than our ancestors came to North America. Well, where did they come from and when did they get here? We don't have precise answers for those questions, but we do know that they came from the east. And this comes from the oral traditions of those Digian-speaking groups. So the Osage, the Kanza, the Omaha, the Ponca, the Quapaw, all have oral traditions that talk about a time when they lived further to the east. Now, we don't know exactly where that was. There are references to maybe the Ohio River. If we link it with archaeological evidence, it might be that some of these groups actually came a little further closer to the Great Lakes. So somewhere in this area. But they also share an oral tradition that they moved westward, and as they moved westward, they split into different groups. And so that's where we start to see some of the variation in their languages and their culture. It's believed that about the time they came either from the tributaries of the Ohio River or into this area, that the Quapaw split off when they reached the Mississippi River and moved south. And the Quapaw are the most distantly related of the Digian groups because they split off fairly early. The others moved up the Mississippi River and then up the Missouri River. And as they did so, they found different places to settle and to make their home. And so the Osage are settled in the area that we would now recognize as east central Missouri. The Kanza, of course, moved a little further upriver, settling in what we now call northeastern Kansas. The Omaha and the Ponca continued up and settled more in the area we now know as Nebraska, eastern Nebraska. And then this is where they made their home for some time. Well, now we can link those language information, we can link that with oral traditions, and we can also link it to the historic record once we get some historical documents. So these are documents that come from some of the very earliest Europeans to move into this area. Of course, they would be the most recent explorers in this area. And so, for example, we have this map from 1718. And this was made by William Delisle, and Delisle never actually traveled to this area, but he was in conversation with fur traders who were either in this area or nearby, and they'd hear from somebody, they'd ask, who's to your west? Who's over up the river further? And from that information, he made a pretty accurate map. You can see the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, various tribes along there. And you notice he has the Kanza or Kanza located at a town site along the Missouri River. He names the river that the tributary river that they're next to as the Small Kansas River. Today we'd know this as a creek. But he also recognizes that this major river he has on here as the river of the Kansas. And this is what we know today as the Kansas River. Now notice he does not show that they're living all along the Kansas River, but rather he recognizes that they have a major settlement along the Missouri River, but that they are no doubt roaming over much of this area. This is their whole territory, and that is why that river actually deserves that name. So it tells us a lot of information about where the Kanza were in 1718, that they had a single village or town, and that they were the dominant tribe throughout this area, throughout what we would now know as northeastern Kansas. This settlement was confirmed in 1724 by a fur trader. There were not many fur traders out here in the early 1700s, but there was a fur trader by the name of de Bourgmont who first established a trading post further down on the Missouri River, and he actually traveled upriver to visit the Kanza in 1724, and he left us some notes about that visit. So we learned a little bit about this community. One of the important things we learned about is, of course, I talked about this as being their whole area that they roamed around. He wanted to not only visit with the Kanza, he wanted to visit with the Plains Apache. Well, the Plains Apache live way far to the west, but they're very mobile also. And the Kanza said, no problem, come with us, we're going on our annual bison hunt. We're gonna go out into the prairies. You can come with us. We know where the Plains Apache will be. They come to the east for bison hunting about the same time we're out there. And they actually got together and introduced de Bourgmont to the Plains Apache. So we know that the Kanza were roaming quite far and wide from this area. And we also know about some of the groups they were encountering when they were out bison hunting. So now we've got not only linguistic information, we have historical information, we also can add to that some archaeological information. So that site that de Bourgmont visited, that is on that 1718 map, archaeologically we know that we call it the Donovan site. It's not what they would have called it, but we call it the Donovan site. It's actually been located. It's near what we now today know as Independence Creek, which, by the way, that name came from Lewis and Clark, who recognized that there was the Kanza had moved on by that time, but they recognized there was an old village there. Most of that site has been destroyed, so we don't have much archaeological evidence from it. But there are two other archaeological sites, one which we call the King Hill site. The King Hill site is located in St. Joseph, Missouri, if you know where that's at. There is another archaeological site in northern Donovan County, the Fanning site, which is in northeastern Kansas. Now, these, we have no written records for these. However, we do have archaeological evidence that we know, for instance, the style of pottery they made, which is actually really beautiful pottery. It's very well decorated. They aren't painting their pots, but they're incising their pots with these lines in very distinctive style. And we know that was the style of the Kanza. And we find that same type of pottery in a little bit of the Donovan site that's remaining, as well as the King Hill site, and as well as at the Fanning site. So we know that these other sites are sites that were occupied by the Kanza prior to living at that site that's recorded in the historic records in the early 1700s. Now we can't date them exactly. However, we do know that they're probably not much earlier, probably in the late 1600s. And the reason we say that is because they're making their traditional pottery and stone tools But there are a few artifacts. I know this doesn't look like much, but you know, archaeologists get excited about the most simple things. So a little ring of metal, of brass. So the Kanza did not have brass until Europeans traded it with them. And so there are a few things, not very many, but a few things that have been recovered from the King Hill site and the Fanning site that are trade goods that were brought by Europeans. Now, there's not very many of them, so that suggests to us that there are not fur traders stationed in that area at that time. There may have been an occasional fur trader that came to visit, or probably more likely, other tribes to their east were trading with fur traders that were more numerous to the east, and then they would trade those things with the tribe, with other tribes. So kind of down the line trade. And since there's not very much of it there, we think that's probably the case. Looking at the historic evidence for when the fur traders were in the area on a permanent basis, we can suggest that this is probably late 1600s because we have no written records, and we know that there were not permanent fur trade posts in this area at that time. Okay, so now we've got various other kinds of information. We can bring in that archaeological information, but it's useful if we can combine it with other information, historic information. Well, I was here to talk about the place that we now know as Manhattan and why the Kanza are associated with this. I haven't gotten to that yet, but feel like I want to give you a little bit of background because they are moving around, and the history that they have along the Missouri River I think is really important. You can see if they're here in the late 1600s, they're here in the 1700s. You know, this is home. This is the place they called home for some time. And there were some important things happening around this time. I already mentioned the fur trade. Well, the first fur trade post that was established along the Missouri River in what would be kind of the heart of the Kanza territory wasn't built until 1744. And this was Fort Cavignon. Fort Cavignon was a French trading post. It was actually a very well established one because it was there for 20 years. A lot of posts were there for just 1 or 2 years. So this was really on the frontier for the French. And they were bringing, you know, tribes from throughout the area were drawn to this. And here it is, very close to where the Kanza are living. We don't know when they left what we call the Donovan site. They were probably there when this trading post was first established. Or they may have been living somewhere else in this area. They may have moved their community to be closer to the post. That's been suggested. There's some hints that may have been the case, but we haven't found those archaeological remains. There's a lot of things we can't find in the archaeological record. In fact, Fort Cavignon, that site, has not been found. We know generally where it is, and a lot of people have speculated exactly where it is, but it has not been confirmed. Basically around where Fort Leavenworth is today, somewhere in that area. Well, why do I mention Fort Cavignon? Well, it was the first major trade post in this area. So this was so important for the Kanza. They were already getting some trade goods from other tribes and occasional traders. By the way, they were probably also getting things like smallpox and other things that they were less desirable. So we don't know how, but they're probably already, their population's probably already being impacted by some of those diseases. But here now you have Fort Cavignon right in their midst. So no doubt they're of being affected by things like diseases more. We also can see that this is the time that they changed their material culture, their technology a lot. So every archaeological site associated with the Kanza that we can date to after this trading post has really no native Maine pottery. Very few stone tools. So they are very rapidly entering into a mercantile type of economy and trading furs and hides, possibly meat and corn and things occasionally, to get metal objects, to get some ceramics, to get cloth. So there's, within one person's lifetime, you would have seen a huge amount of change in the technology they used, and the just seeing people with very different cultural traditions experiencing deaths by diseases that were totally new to you. So I like to point out Fort Cavagnan because I think this was a period of extremely rapid change for the Kanza. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, we don't have much archaeological evidence for that, just because we're lacking those sites. Now, so what happens after this 20-year period where Fort Cavagnan there? The French still are trading in the area, but they are not necessarily right there. And what we see after this is that the Kanza move yet again. So this time we're looking at a map from the 1790s. Unfortunately, we don't have any in between those two. Again, the Missouri River, the Kansas River, and they are no longer living along the Kansas or the Missouri River. They have now shifted out to the Kansas River, which is a place they would have been very, very familiar with, and they establish a new settlement here. Notice I've talked about one settlement at a time. The Kanza are a relatively small tribe, and it appears that they always lived together. Well, we'll see later that changes a little bit, but lived together as a tribe in a single community. The question's always raised about, well, why did they move? Well, we could say it would put them closer to the bison that they hunted and they were very dependent on. That's certainly possible. I think Fort Cavagnan has something to do with this too. One thing that when you look at what happens at fur trade posts is, remember, that was one of very, very few in the area. It was really on the frontier. So the Kanza were not the only ones who were trading there. Tribes from the north, like the Pawnee, tribes from the east, like the Sac and Fox, the Iowa, they would have all been drawn to Fort Cavagnan, even though they lived a little further away. A lot of those tribes were the enemies of the Kanza. So I suspect after a while, it might have been nice initially to have that fur trade post right nearby to get the things you needed. But after a while, you might have realized, oh, wait a minute. Now we got all these other tribes coming here, and you have more fights going on, and you've got disease more readily available to you, and all these things that may not have been very desirable. It is my speculation, but looking at many fur trade records from different places, different times, we see these kinds of things that once a fur trade post is there, it's not always desirable to live near that fur trade post. So I think eventually they moved westward to get away from that hubbub of everything going on there. And the Missouri River was a major route for people going up and down, up to the northern tribes too, increasingly more and more. And although that's sometimes handy, I think the Kanza probably decided, we can go back there whenever we want. They're very mobile, that's no problem. But maybe on a day-to-day living, we want to be a little further away from that. So, by 1795, probably earlier, we have at least one reference in one of the fur trade documents that one of the common traders, Pierre Chateau, actually refers to being on the Kansas River trading with the Kanza in 1790. So I think their settlement was already established by that time, and it could have been even much more before that. So let's look at this settlement a little bit more. You may notice it's up on the Kansas River, just below where a tributary stream or river comes in. So, today's map, that would be there. This is the place that we now call home, that we now call Manhattan. So we've referred, people have referred to this, even historic records refer to this town as Blue Earth. No doubt the name derived from being near the mouth of the Blue River. So here's the Blue River, Manhattan is here, but as you know, Manhattan has spread into Pottawatomie County. And this site, unfortunately, has pretty much been destroyed by the development of Manhattan by our historic ancestors. But we still have some good information about what life might have been like a little bit for the Kanza at this location. And this is my favorite image because this actually gives you a look of what Blue Earth Town may have did look like. So this is an actual sketch that dates to 1819, and it was made by a man by the name of Titian Peale. Titian Ramsay Peale was a member of the Stephen Long expedition. And some of you may be familiar with the Stephen Long expedition. In 1819, Stephen Long was sent by the federal government to do some explorations. He was initially supposed to take 2 years to go up the Missouri River as far as what we now know as North Dakota and Montana. They got their team up to basically about Omaha the first year and then wintered there. And over the winter, the federal government said, we're going to change our mind. Instead of going up the Missouri River, we want you to follow the Platte River to the west and go to the Rocky Mountains. Okay, so that happened in 1820. Side story there, in a way. But another side branch of that story is that as Stephen Long's expedition was going up the Missouri River, he decided he was going to send representatives from his group to walk up the Kansas River Valley to go and meet the Kanza at their village, because he knew that where they lived, and he wanted to make contact with them, actually ask them to come to the Missouri River and meet him, but wanted to actually send people up to see their town. So he sent 9 individuals from the larger expeditionary crew, and most of those individuals were scientists. And they, in August, as you can imagine, walking up the Kansas River, not really knowing where you're going. You have a guide who obviously doesn't know where he's going if you read some of the journals. And eventually, after a long, hot trek, they came to the Kanza village or community and were welcomed there. Titian Peale happened to be among those individuals. Titian Peale was along because he was hired as an assistant naturalist. So he was trained in biology, and he was to help a man by the name of Thomas Say, who was an entomologist and biologist, to collect samples on the expedition. And the nice thing about Titian Peale is he was trained as a naturalist, but he was one of many sons and daughters of a man by the name of Charles Wilson Peale. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Charles Wilson Peale, but I'm sure you've seen some of his work. Charles Wilson Peale was an artist in Philadelphia, and he's famous for painting the famous paintings of George Washington and all these statesmen. Of course, he insisted all of his children become artists, even if that's not how they were employed. So Titian Peale is on this expedition as a naturalist, but he carries a sketchbook with him, and fortunately we have that sketchbook. And didn't do a lot of sketches while he was at the Kanza village or Kanza town, but he did do some. And so what we see here is his sketch of Blue Earth Town. So Blue Earth Town, you see these dome-shaped houses. We call them earth lodges because they are covered with earth, but they have, of course, a very sturdy wooden structure underneath them, as you can see, because people hang out on top of them. In fact, I think Titian Peale is sitting on top of one of those, looking out over the community. I can't say for sure which direction he's looking, but I really, really, really think it's to the northwest. And why do I think that? Well, there's trees here, so there must be some stream. Well, he could be looking to the south, that could be the Kansas River, or he could be looking to the northwest, and that could be the Blue River. I got a range of hills. Well, you've got that to the south, you've got that to the northwest. Doesn't help a whole lot. But this hill right here, it's got this little bump on top of it. Actually, there's one like that to the south too, but I think this one is the one that would be to the northwest. I'm sure all of you are familiar with Bluemont Hill, which is the hill that says Manhattan across it. I can't say this for absolute sure, but I'm pretty sure Manhattan should be inscribed right there. If that's the case, he is looking over part of the village, looking to the northwest, and this would be the land between the Kansas River, which would be behind him, and the Blue River up here, Tuttle Creek Reservoir off to this area. Now, Blue Earth Town, we can see what the houses look like and see that they've got people hanging out around there up in the village and nearby. The other things that we can see is that, you know, the houses, but this is a large town. You notice I use the word village and I use the word town, because we've always talked about it as a village, but that really doesn't make sense. I mean, most of us don't even know what a village is. It's not a common term we use, but when we do, we picture something small. A town is something bigger. The population of this town was probably anywhere between 1,200 and 1,900 people. So it's a good size, a lot bigger than a lot of our small towns in Kansas today. So we really do need to think of it more as a town. But you don't see enough houses there for 1,200 people. So how do we know there were that many people there? Well, there are some fur trade documents that, you know, say up the Kansas River is the Kanza village that has. Sometimes they reported 1,900 people, sometimes they reported 1,500 people. Well, are they exaggerating? Well, I don't think so. Because we also have this bit of evidence. So this is a map of Blue Earth Town, or the site, after 50 years after it had been abandoned. So those earth lodges had all collapsed. It's an abandoned field in effect. But when an earth lodge collapses, it leaves behind a berm of a ring of where that foundation of that house was. And so you could see that on the surface. The Kansas State Historical Society was formed in the 1870s. It was approved by the legislature in 1879. The director of the Kansas State Historical Society, when it was, became a formal entity, wanted to start documenting the history of what we now know Kansas. And he wanted to document the Native American history for this area. So he was taking all kinds of notes and visiting places where people still knew that the Kanza had lived. And so this place was known, and the director of the Kansas State Historical Society at that time said, we need to document this. So he hired a man by the name of Henry Stackpole, who lived here in Manhattan, to go out to this location and draw a map of what remained of the abandoned Blue Earth village or town. So what you see here are where those rings of earth, where earth lodges had collapsed. Yes?
Was the Kansas River?
Yes. Yeah, so looking north that way, this is the Kansas River here. Now, the Kansas River has changed a lot. So it was probably by that time starting to erode into the village. It had been further to the south, probably when the Kanza actually lived here. But you can see roughly where that is today. Or actually, it's not there today. It has gone even further. It's up more around here now. So a portion of that site has been lost. So where you see each of these darker, bigger rings, that is where an earth lodge once stood. You see some other smaller rings and some of these double rings. Some of those are what archaeologists call cache pits. They're basically cellars. So the Kanza were farmers, and they needed to store their produce, and so dig a hole in the ground, and you can store it in there. And those collapse inward after they're abandoned. And so I think that's how he was designating. Some of them tend to be bell-shaped, so that they have a narrow top and then widen at the bottom. And that's how oftentimes you see the double ring shown for that. So from Titian Peel's drawing, you can see only a few houses of this town. But if my speculation is correct, he was probably on one of these lodges over here, looking this direction, which means there was a lot behind him. There was a much bigger community right there. So this is how we can, there are more than 100, it's a nightmare to try to count these, but there are more than 120 earth lodge depressions, and then a lot of other depressions there too. And these earth lodges varied in size, but you could easily have an extended family of anywhere around 10 people perhaps living in an earth lodge. So if you have 120 or more earth lodges, you're talking at least 1,200 people. So even though fur traders may have occasionally exaggerated some of the numbers, I don't think we're too far off. We do have some archaeological evidence from the Blue Earth town or the Blue Earth site. Unfortunately, not too long after Stackpole made that map, the river continued to erode into the site. Farmers started to cultivate the land around there. By 1930s, a major tree nursery had been established there, which meant that there's all kinds of holes dug into what was, formerly a town. And so much of the community, or much of the archaeological remains of the site, had been destroyed by even the 1930s. In 1937, an archaeologist by the name of Waldo Wedel, there's always all these interesting side stories. Waldo Wedel is from Kansas, and he became an archaeologist with the Smithsonian Institution. He's kind of known as the father of plains archaeology. He was so well known and did lots of wonderful work, but his heart always lay in Kansas. So he came back to Kansas often. And he was hired by the Smithsonian in 1936, and so they said, here's a couple $1,000, an old beat-up vehicle, go do some archaeology, go where you want. So he said, I'm going to Kansas. And he did some work. Remember the Fanning site that I mentioned way back along the Missouri River? Well, he did some work there. That's how we know what some of the finds that were there. He also tried to find the Donovan site. That a lot of the site had already been destroyed, so he was only able to find a little bit. You can see he's trying to track the Kanza. So he came to Manhattan and went out to the Blue Earth site and did have a difficult time because it was so, a lot of it being destroyed by modern development. But he was able to uncover, through his excavations, the floor of one of those lodges. And you could no longer at that point see where the lodges were at by the rings, but he was able to identify that enough to then do his excavations. And you see, this is actually a relatively small lodge. There are 4 central support posts that would have held up beams in the center. There are other large posts around the around the circle that would have been further out that would have held up other beams, and then you could put stringers between those. That would be the wooden superstructure holding up the earthen cover. You also see the entryway, like we saw in Titian Peel's drawing, a central fireplace, and then a pit within the lodge for storing. He also found a number of pits outside various lodges. And so you can see how that's represented here. So we've got an exterior sketch. We've got archaeological evidence that shows us what some of the support was like. And then we have another wonderful painting or drawing of the inside of one of these Kanza lodges. This is, again, at Blue Earth Town. So remember the Stephen Long crew who came to visit the Kanza? They had along with them Samuel Seymour. Samuel Seymour was hired to be on the Stephen Long expedition as an artist. So his job, it wasn't Tish and Peel's job, but it was Samuel Seymour's job to document what they saw with sketches and paintings. Unfortunately, we don't have many of those, but we do have this one. It's the only one we have of his from the Blue Earth Town, but it is the inside of the lodge. So again, center support posts and other support posts out further. If you'll notice, if you can count them, there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 behind us, 8 center support posts instead of 4. So this is a much larger lodge. Fireplace in the center, and then other support posts out there. You can see the beams across that, and then stringers, and then those stringers of wood would have been covered with mats and grass, and then sod on top of that. This is some of the earliest evidence or historical documentation of earth lodges. We know them very well today, but it's because of the finds at Blue Earth Town that we have really good early historical evidence of them. You can see little things like they covered the floor with mats, so you don't have to walk on the dirt necessarily. You can see that they had benches, and those would have also served as beds. Now this lodge was probably the lodge of an extra lodge from one of the leaders of the village, of the town. And this is where the men from Stephen Long's crew stayed while they were visiting. You can actually see them in the background there. And the primary leader probably had another lodge that he lived in. But he probably also had multiple wives. And so this may have been one of his wives who was probably assigned to take care of the visitors while they were there. In fact, the leaders of the Kanza community had to leave to go to the Missouri River to meet Stephen Long. So they met his small crew there, and then they left for the Missouri River to talk with Stephen Long on the Missouri River while they stayed for a couple days. You get some other images here. The men, the Kanza men, this is in their notes, in the notes of the Stephen Long expedition, that the Kanza men came in to entertain the visitors one night with what they referred to as a war dance, but a dance. We do know that there was a woman who provided them with food and whatever they needed. You can see a little bit of that. Tish and Peel, as I mentioned, he didn't do a lot of sketching while he was at Blue Earth Town. He did basically the lodge of the community, and then he actually did some, this one sketch also of some of the Kanza themselves. So you can see how the woman dressed with leggings, a skirt, and usually a shawl that went over one shoulder or a blanket over, and apparently carrying a child. Whereas the men, we can see what their hairstyle was, and this is very well known. It was documented by other fur traders that knew the Kanza, as well as the Osage were similar, that they would pluck or shave the hair from their heads, except for a scalp lock. And rumor is that they kept that one part of their hair there, should they ever be killed by their enemy, that their enemy would have a scalp to take. They oftentimes decorated that and used what's called a roach, where they might put a deer tail or sometimes even porcupine quills they decorate with, and pierce their ears, wear ornaments. So I just love these little illustrations, sometimes wearing a feather in their hair also. You see some excellent information about the Kanza. So this gives us a look at what the Kanza village of Blue Earth, or Kanza community of Blue Earth, may have been like, at least in terms of its houses, its population, who the people were in terms of, you know, what they may have looked like, what kinds of things they did. We can draw on other information to learn some other things about the Kanza, and specifically for this period that they are living here. So,
You haven't mentioned the period, how long were
oh,
they?
I'm sorry, and I actually thought I had that on here, but I guess I actually was hesitant because I thought I had it there. So they were at this location from at least 1790 up to about 1830. Now I'll mention in a moment that things kind of changed around between 1825 and 1830. So we don't know when, probably not all the tribes stayed here all the way till 1830, but some of them did. I'll get back to that in a moment. So we're talking 40 years, roughly, probably more than that, because I think they're probably there before 1780 or 1790. Does that answer your question? Okay, so what else do we know about the Kanza? Well, so they were farmers, or the women were farmers, and raised an important part of their diet. They planted corn, beans, squash, and melons being introduced by Europeans. They would be at Blue Earth Town in the spring, because that was the time when they needed to do their cultivation, plant the crops. Once they were germinated, though, the village or all the Kanza packed up, and they all went, the whole family, every one of the families left and would be gone for a month, maybe 2 months, and they would hike out onto the prairies and the plains, going west and often southwest to hunt bison. So their two main food sources were their garden produce and their bison meat. Actually, I should add other meats too. They hunted a lot of deer and a lot of elk also. So this was, the Kanza remember these bison hunts as being the glorious times of the year. They're out on the plains where they could enjoy each other's company. Yeah, it would have been a lot of work. The men are hunting the bison, tracking the bison, hunting the bison, starting the butchering. The women were doing a lot also, not only moving everything and establishing houses. They would build more temporary houses out of bark and mats and hides. But then they also would be helping with the butchering, the drying of the meat, the at least initial preparing of the hides. So it was a very busy time, but it was also a very social time that the Kanza had wonderful memories of. Then they would return to Blue Earth Town by the late summer, because this is when they would have the green corn harvest. That was kind of the special beginning of harvest time. And so they'd have major harvest, and then they would continue that through the fall, or through the late summer into the fall. And so you can imagine you're coming back to your town and you're just loaded with all kinds of bison meat, also lots of heavy hides that need to be cleaned and processed. But then you're coming back also to all of your garden produce. So it was a time of a lot of abundance. This is the time when the Stephen Long expedition showed up, and they talk about how much food they had. They had fresh bison meat, they had fresh pumpkins, they had stew made with pumpkins and corn and meat, lots and lots of food. And of course that's a great way to entertain. So they were usually said, okay, come to my lodge. And they learned right away, you go to a lodge, you have to eat, because it's not courteous to not eat. But don't eat too much, because right after that, someone's going to take you to another lodge and feed you. So lots of food. Then in the winter, oftentimes they would take another trip out onto the plains for another bison hunt. And again, that would be the whole community going. But they also spent oftentimes part of the winter broken up into smaller groups, family groups that would go back east. So you think about northeastern Kansas. It's got more trees, it's more sheltered, and it has fur-bearing animals. Now, a lot of the beaver had already been hunted out, but otters were prevalent in northeastern Kansas. And so they would go in smaller groups back east, closer to the Missouri River. And there they could trap and hunt otters and other fur-bearing animals, and lots of deer and elk. Those were the things that they traded with the fur traders. That's what the fur traders wanted. Actually, the fur traders really wanted beaver, but there weren't many beaver left. So they got a lot of deer and elk hides and a fair number of otter hides from the Kanza. So going east was also useful because that meant that's where the fur traders had their posts. By this time, there was a major post at what is now Independence, Missouri, in that general area. And so that was one of the trading posts they went to. And so we know that they were trading for metal objects, for cloth, for ornaments. And these, just to give you an example, these are just some of the items that had been found by Waldo Wedel when he did his archaeological excavations at Blue Earth Town. So you can get a good sense of what they had. Now, Waldo Wedel had hoped he would also see some of their native pottery so he could tie the Blue Earth Town to some of the earlier sites. He did not find any native pottery. By this time, they have completely replaced, well, not completely replaced, but they replaced a lot of their technology. So no longer making many stone tools, no longer making their own ceramic objects. They're using a lot of metal tools. So replacing their ceramic pots for cooking and water and storage with metal kettles, using those extensively. When they started to fall apart, no problem, you recycle them. You cut the metal and you make arrow points out of them. So you don't have to go make flint knap and stone arrow points. You just make it out of metal. So they're trading for things like files to help make this. Lots of knives. They replaced their stone knives with metal knives. And of course stones, special kinds of stones for sharpening those metal knives. Remember the individual with the pierced ears, metal and other kinds of earrings, as well as other ornaments, and cloth and decorated with what's called tinsel lace was a real common way. They were using the flintlock guns, but there were some problems with those. They weren't always reliable, and they were expensive to get, and they were hard to keep up. So they were still using a bow and arrow, especially when they're hunting bison. And so that's why they still have metal arrows. Okay, yes?
Could you address the role of the horse?
Okay, yeah, the role of the horse. So we know that the horse was being used by tribes in this area by certainly the 1600s. So the horse would have been, well integrated into the Kanza by the time we have historic records. And not that they were necessarily numerous. The de Bourgmont, who visited the Donovan site, what we call the Donovan site, on the Missouri River, and then traveled west with the Kanza in 1724. He did mention horses. They had horses, but they were still also carrying a lot of things themselves, and their dogs were carrying a lot of things. Horses were an extremely valuable commodity. They do not appear to have been breeding their own horses. That means that as your horse got old, you had to go purchase one from someone else. This is one of the reasons why they kept contact with the tribes to the west, because the tribes to the west had access to a lot more horses. And so they would oftentimes trade for other goods for horses. The tribes to the west didn't always have access to guns because the Spanish didn't like to trade guns with them. But the French would trade guns and the Americans would trade guns. And so the Kanza and other groups that are more to the east could get guns, and then they could take them to the west and trade for horses, because those were probably the two most expensive things. Do you have another question?
Just worried about horses dragging loads as well as carrying.
Right, right. So we don't have a direct reference for the Kanza using the travois, which is the horse-drawn trailer, I guess you might call it. But we do know that other tribes were doing that at this time, and they were using the same thing for their dogs. Of course, a little bit smaller. So our supposition is that they were using those. I think that the majority of the horses were probably saved more for hunting, bison. So there was still a lot of carrying your own things. And they were traveling overland. Even though they lived along rivers, the Kanza did not use, if someone else had a boat, they'd use it, but they did not make their own boats. They did a lot of just walking on land. And if you've ever looked at the Kansas River, you probably know why. There's times when you can go great on the Kansas River in your canoe or whatever, but there's other times you can't. So just walk is more reliable. Okay, so I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of Blue Earth Town. So this place that we now call Manhattan has a long history that even precedes the Kanza. But we can see that the Kanza were here by at least by the late 18th century, but they had already been using this general area for probably hunting back into the 1600s. So this was, even if they weren't living in Blue Earth Town, this would have been part of their homeland for a very long time. Well, why are they not here today? That's a whole nother big story, but just to kind of introduce part of that, I mentioned earlier that even though Blue Earth Town was occupied by the Kanza up till about 1830, or at least some of the Kanza by that time, there were a lot of things that were changing, especially in the 1820s. Now, a lot of this was pressures that came from the outside. So you have external politics. What I mean by this is the American government, the federal government. We have an expanding Euro-American population that's moving westward very rapidly. And they are coming right up to Kanza territory during this time. By 1821, there are enough Euro-American settlers and African-American slaves in what is now, we now recognize as Missouri, that the state was formed. So think about the Kanza. Their territory is right here, and they have all kinds, not just fur traders, but now they have all kinds of people moving in, looking to settle in this area. So there's a lot of pressure. And the federal government realized they needed land for their expanding population. And so they're going to put additional pressure on the Kanza. Add to that, I only made passing reference to this, but the federal government for a while managed a number of what they called factories. They're not really factories, they're trading posts. There were private trading posts. But in order to kind of keep the prices down, because out in the frontier, you're a private trader, you can charge whatever you want, right? Unless you have competition. And so the federal government established some trading posts on various places along the frontier to try to help keep that, I'm sure it really helped that much, but to try to keep prices fair, I guess. And for the Kanza, Fort Osage, which was established near, I mentioned before, what is now Independence, Missouri. If you ever get a chance, go visit. It's a cool place to go visit. It named Fort Osage because it was established primarily for the Osage, trading with the Osage. The Osage were in this area. However, this was one of the major trading posts for the Kanza also. So when they came east, this is oftentimes where they would go to do their trading. That trade system was maintained, or Fort Osage was maintained from 1808 to 1822. And so the federal government closed that down in 1822, which meant you still have private traders out there, but now you don't have that as much competition. So it's not going to be very fair for the Native American groups trying to trade there. The other thing that happened, well, this has been happening for some time. Of course, the federal government, ever since its beginnings, had been establishing treaties with various tribes. The first treaty that had been signed between the federal government and the Kanza was in 1815, and that was basically a treaty of friendship, just recognizing that we're friends, right? But there is that demand for land. So in 1825, well, starting in the 1820s, the federal government is realizing we really have to get these lands for our Euro-American settlers. So we're going to have to take it from the Native American tribes. So they started a series of treaties, and there are a number of them that happened in 1825, including with the Osage. As you can see, the Osage lands are now in the state of Missouri. So they had a treaty with the Osage, and the next day they signed a treaty with the Kanza. This was in June of 1825. First of all, notice it's called I call it the St. Louis Treaty because it required that the Kanza come all the way to St. Louis. They traveled a lot, but think about, it's kind of like, the sports teams. When you're on the road, the chances of success are not as good as when you're in your own backyard, right? So, federal government insists you come to our territory, and we're going to present you with a treaty, and you are going to sign it. There wasn't a lot of negotiation there. And so in 1825, the Kanza, in effect, forcefully had to sign a treaty that gave up their lands, or a good portion of their lands. Now, first of all, the Kanza don't have the same sense of ownership as we have. So their lands were all of those lands out there. They didn't have a boundary to them. They weren't one particular place, and no one person owned it. It was used by all of the tribe, and other tribes could use that too. So the federal government is imposing a whole different way of viewing the land. And being from different cultural traditions, neither of them really understood each other in that way, at least not very well. So this is the boundaries. So here's Kansas City, give you a sense of where we're at. Of what the Treaty of 1825 says the Kanza, this was their territory. I don't think this is how the Kanza really thought of their territory. First of all, they wouldn't have seen a boundary on it. Second of all, I don't think they were really up in this area too long. They may have told the federal government, yeah, that's our area, because really the Pawnee were there and they didn't want the Pawnee to have it. So I think they may have said that. We also know that they were coming down further south than this when they went hunting. So, the boundaries here are imposed by the federal government, even though they were asking them, which areas do you use? They also, look at this. This cuts them off from the other side of the river. We know that they used to have a village on the other side of the river. So not very reliable information here. But anyway, the federal government in that treaty took all this land, millions of acres of land, and they did set aside a reservation. So this is the first reservation set aside for the Kanza. You can see a drastic decrease in the amount of land given to them. Now, again, they didn't really recognize boundaries, so it's not like they stayed in those boundaries. But they could get in trouble if, there were some problems outside of those boundaries. See where Manhattan is? So Blue Earth Town is right there. So they did put the reservation such that it included Blue Earth Town. It also, they purposely made it very long out here because they knew that the Kanza went west to hunt bison. And so this was meant for them to go west. But try to imagine, do you think that the Kanza were going, oh, it's time for our bison hunt. Oh, we have to go directly west. We can't go here, we can't go there. No, they weren't. And in fact, they didn't like going out here because the Pawnee were here and they were vulnerable to attacks. So typically they were going more out this direction. They had hunted a lot along the Smoky Hill River, and they also eventually, especially increasingly more, down towards the Arkansas, Big Bend region. So anyway, this was a big change for the Kanza. It's the beginning of imposing a different cultural tradition. Well, it's not the beginning of it, but it really accentuated that Euro-American perspective being forced upon peoples who have a very different perspective or culture. So you've got all these external pressures on the Kanza that has internal impacts. And of course, we can't know what all of those were, but we do know that, remember I said that the Kanza tribe lived in a single community as a tribe. Well, they didn't have one single leader. They had a series of men who would be selected to lead. One may have kind of inherited that position, but it was always kind of an iffy position. You always had to be sure you were, pleasing everyone in the tribe to maintain that position, and you had advisors. But there was always competition within the tribe for, who really gets to say over things. But they managed to hold themselves together until the Heat Treaty of 1825. It's not everybody, actually most of the leaders all pretty much signed the treaty, but they didn't really know what they were signing, and they really didn't have any choice. But there were factions started to grow stronger within the tribe. And so after 1825, there was a lot more factionalism, and we no longer had a focus on one central kind of consulting group for the tribe, but rather 3 different individuals who basically collected followers from within the tribe. And so the tribes, they're still all recognize themselves as Kanza, and they all still kind of stayed together, but they didn't necessarily stay in the same village after that. These three individuals were known kind of as major leaders: Fool Chief, the first, American Chief, and Heart Chief. There's one other, White Plume, and I'm working on a manuscript right now about White Plume, so I won't talk about him because we'll be here another 3 hours. But White Plume was a little bit different. I'm not really sure he had many followers, but he loved making himself helpful to the Americans. So the Americans, the federal government, recognized him as the chief, the principal chief of the Kanza tribe. I don't think most of the tribe did, no. So anyway, this is part of the example of, the effects of things like treaties, and the federal government is really changing a lot within the Kanza tribe. And after all these movements over the years between these towns, and after the Treaty of 1825 and this factionalism develops, different communities were established. In 1828, there were 4 different communities that we know of. I think one of those was still Blue Earth Town. But then by 1831, 3 major towns had been established by Fool Chief, Heart Chief, and American Chief. They had moved down the Kansas River. I should have on here where the reservation was. The reservation extended basically from here to the west. White Plume, being a little bit different, he had his home next to the Kanza Agency. The Kanza Agency was the federal installation for managing the Kanza Treaty, and it was established off the reservation further to the east. And White Plume got along probably better with the Americans than he did with his own tribe, perhaps. And he even had the federal government build him a 2-story stone house, which not even the Euro-Americans had. So, he wielded power with or influence with the Americans, and there was a reason they reciprocated that, which I won't get into. But, he was kind of off from the rest of the tribe. He did eventually move back as he got older and the Kanza agency was moved. He did eventually move into Full Chief Village. So he did maintain ties with the Kanza. So these villages, or these towns were occupied for from about 1831 up to about 1844. There was a major flood of the Kansas River Valley in 1844. We know that Full Chief Village was flooded. Hard Chief's Village was at a higher elevation, was probably not flooded, but their croplands probably were. And meanwhile, there is more and more pressure from Euro-Americans coming in. They're being impacted by disease. It was a very, very difficult time for about 2 years. They just kind of had to move around from one place to the other, and eventually they moved to a new reservation, and they moved down to the area that we now know around Council Grove, which the tribe today has purchased back the land that some of these villages, or at least one of these towns was on. I won't get into all the story there. This is a very interesting story. It was a very devastating time for the Kanza, and if you'd like to learn more about that, read Ron Park's book, The Darkest Period. They were there then for another couple decades. Population, remember we talked about maybe around 1,900 people at Blue Earth. By this time, we're talking only several hundred Kanza remaining, largely because of disease and other difficulties with pressure from the outside. So here shows you, this is that reservation. So we've gone from, if these boundaries were not right, but we can think about the Kanza territory being at least that large, down to something that's assigned to them like this, and then down to this. And then eventually they moved from there to moved into Oklahoma, where their headquarters are today. So in 1873, they were removed from what we now know as Kansas. They were removed from their homelands completely down to Oklahoma or Indian Territory. So the Kaw Nation today, of course, the people who live there today, they grew up in Oklahoma. That is their homeland today, but the Kaw Nation people live everywhere, including in Kansas, but they still recognize Kansas as their homeland. And Blue Earth is a town that they recognize, as many of their ancestors were buried there. And so wherever their ancestors were is where is their homeland. So I've given you a little bit of a story leading up to these individuals. As I mentioned before, this individual, Little Knife, I think is his name, probably lived in Blue Earth town for a while, and then would have lived in some of the later communities. All the others are later, and many more stories yet to come from that. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take questions and also